Our class today is about a topic. It's a topic in Halakha, which is, I can say, a very sensitive issue. But this discussion started based on an email that I got from a friend, one of our congregants, who is deaf-mute. And he attends services here. Usually have an interpreter to do ASL, American Sign Language. And he himself was invited as an interpreter to a Shabbaton for the deaf-blind. He described it to me. It was just amazing. There were basically 18 people who are deaf-blind.
Wait, they have both afflictions or either?
Deaf and blind.
All 18 were deaf and blind?
Yes, right. 18 people who are deaf and blind. And with the support group around them, families and counselors and interpreters, there were 90 people. Meaning that, it's really, in order to interpret, you need two, sometimes three people. Basically, he holds the hands of the deaf-blind person and sends messages through touch. But for him to know what is being said, he has to look at the person who is interpreting the language to ASL. So, spoken word to sign language to touch. And he says that they prefer to do this than to take a hearing person to do the touch signs, because as a deaf-mute person, he has greater sensitivity and greater understanding of the nuances of the language. So all this is very complicated. So, and it also really brings us to this, thinking of how much we should appreciate what we have. That to have this kind of impediment of someone not being able to fully engage in what is happening around them, and not to be able to get to process this kind of information. So what happened, and this is what started this class, he sent me an email that when they had the prayers Shabbat morning, and this is all from people, rabbis of different levels who are doing it to have the Shabbat experience. But when they had the Torah reading, he noticed that the first three Aliyot were given to hearing people and not to deaf-mute or deaf-blind. So we approached the rabbi who organized it, and he pushed him. And finally, the fourth and fifth Aliyah were given to a deaf-mute person, and the seventh, sixth Aliyah and seventh Aliyah were given to a deaf-blind person. And he insisted, says, I want to know, why don't you give us one of the regular Aliyot, Kohen, Levi, Israel, one of the regular Aliyot? Finally, the rabbi said, it's because the blessing has to be said in front of 10 people, and the 10 people have to hear the blessing. So he emailed me to ask, being that this is such a unique occasion, can you bend the halakha? What are the parameters of the halakha on that issue? So this is something that I thought about before, and I dealt with different halakhic questions that are related to it somehow, but the first thing that I wanted to do is to try to understand why in the mentality of the rabbis there was a distinction between deafness and blindness. Because it seems that from the very beginning there is, if you look at halachot, a deaf-mute person always sort of put to one side and the blind person to another side. So I felt that there are a couple of factors here. A blind person can communicate because he has the command of the language. He can communicate, and that always was the case. That through the spoken word, you could communicate with that person, and he could communicate back. And so people felt that they are on the same level. They have some kind of contact with that person. On the other hand, a deaf-mute person, until I think very recently that the idea of sign language was fully developed, in many cases those people lived in isolation, were not able to communicate with others, or only with people who were very close to them, so they were cut off in terms of communication from the rest of the world, and therefore did not have this kind of a dialogue where people could understand where they are, what their problem is. I think also paradoxically, there's something which is opposite. People tend to think that being blind is much worse than being deaf. Most people think that. I think that if you ask most people, what is worse, losing one's hearing completely or losing eyesight, they will tell you obviously eyesight. But psychologists and people who work, with the and they say neuroscientists say that it's actually not true. That the majority of the information that we process comes through the ears, much more than what comes through the eyes. And you realize that when even as we're sitting here, what we can see with our eyes is within a certain range and a certain scope, but we hear things from all over, and that is a process that starts already in the womb. So for someone to be cut off from sound is a terrible isolation, terrible isolation. Even though they could make eye contact and see, for someone to be deaf blind this is really I don't think it's really unbearable to think of that. So when the rabbis were dealing with those issues, they look at the person who's blind, can still communicate, and they think even though his loss is so immense, still he can communicate. So here's an intelligent person. Whereas where they try to communicate with a deaf mute, who they think should be more intelligent because he only lost his hearing and he cannot communicate, and say, so he's not intelligent at all because his loss is not that great, yet he cannot communicate. So it's a paradox. So that's why the rabbis put the deaf mute in the same category with the minor and with what they call a fool, shoteh, someone who's mentally ill, because they felt that they have no da'at. The concept called da'at is intelligence or wisdom or discretion, and that is something that a deaf mute person does not possess. So that's, I think, the second reason why the rabbis treated blindness differently than
what year
deafness.
Are you talking about?
I'm talking about the rabbis of the Mishnah, going back 2,000 years. The third reason that over the years, even though in the early years of the Mishnah, the rabbis made some restrictions for blind people, but those were eased slowly throughout the generations, and that is, I think, because it was much more common for someone to be a scholar, even though he was blind, or for someone who was a scholar to lose his eyesight with the years completely, more commonly than completely losing his hearing. So the rabbis felt more an ability to empathize with the blind than with the deaf, because there were many rabbis who were blind, but not that many who were deaf.
Were there actually berachot at that time?
At the time of the Mishnah, yes. We're talking about exactly about the time where the berachot are established. Okay. It's exactly the period we're talking about. So let's go through the sources that we have here. So the first source that it's commonly cited in all the sources that deal with the halakha is this: Tnan, Suma, eno koreh b'Torah. Suma is the Aramaic language, Aramaic word for a blind person. In Hebrew it's iver. In Aramaic they say Suma. So Suma cannot read the Torah. Everybody refers to this phrase in the Talmud or in the Mishnah, but it's really not written there. It's only by omission that we say that a blind person cannot read the Torah, because they speak about other people who could do certain things in the Bet Knesset, and they say they cannot do A, B, C, and the blind person cannot do A and C, but they not mention B, so they came to the conclusion that a blind person cannot read the Torah. So that was the original law of the Mishnah. We're talking about almost 2,000 years ago. The Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, writes the following. I'm reading the Hebrew first and then the English. כתב נימוקי יוסף בשם ספר האשכול, היינו לומר דאינו קורא על פה, אבל הוא קומא איניש אחרינה, שפותח ורואה והסומה מברך ועומד בצידו, שפיר דמה. So the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, in the 1500s, writes, in the name of Rabbi Yosef ben Haviva from Spain, from the 14th century, he says, when the Mishnah says that the blind person cannot read the Torah, it means that he cannot read it by heart. Because you're not allowed to read by heart written verses. That is the rule. Dvarim shebichtav yata rashay lomram be'al peh. So you cannot recite by heart parts of the written law, which is, in other circumstances, this ban sort of was lifted. But here what we see is that a later rabbi, much later, about more than 1,000 years after the Mishnah, says, "Oh, I look at this halakha that says that a blind person cannot read the Torah, and I'm telling you this is only to read it by heart. But if the cantor or the reader stands next to him and reads it out loud, and he repeats it, it's okay." So one of two things: either that reservation or qualification of the law was contained in the original law, or it was not. It could be that it's an interpretation or an accommodation. Rabbi Yosef ben Haviva, the author of Nimukei Yosef, for some reason felt that a blind person should be able to get an Aliyah, and he said, okay, so as long as he does not read the Torah himself, but someone reads it out loud and he hears it, it's okay. So from a later period, from Rabbi Mordechai, who lived in Poland in the 16th century, we read this. He says, "B'sha'at adhak ulhafiz da'ato shel suma delalete le'insuyei סומכים בזה על הזוהר, דסביר על ידעת רבה אסור לקרות עם השליח ציבור בתורה, כמו שהיה עיין בנתינתה שמשה ידבר וכל ישראל שותקין." So he says, by the way, the Bet Yosef who quotes the previous statement that a blind person can get an Aliyah doesn't agree with that. He rejected. He says, no way, a blind person cannot get an Aliyah, and that is his final ruling. And many later rabbis followed in his path, and they said a blind person cannot get an Aliyah. That was in most Sephardic communities. In the Ashkenazi communities, however, they were more lenient or strict, however you look at it, strict about not hurting his feelings. So they said, Bish'at adhak, when there is a need, let's say maybe if you don't have someone else to call to the Torah, or if you need to give the blind person an Aliyah, there's a specific need, let's say there's a wedding or he has a yortzeit, then you cannot come up with an excuse that he cannot receive an Aliyah. And in order to appease him, so there will not be a dispute for that person to be, the blind person will say, why are you not giving me an Aliyah? Like my friend Alon said, why are you not giving the deaf blind or the deaf mute an Aliyah? And he was fighting with them. In order to prevent that from happening, or in some cases where, and I didn't mention here, Rabbi Haim David Alevi, the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, writes of a case where someone was publicly prevented from getting an Aliyah, was embarrassed, and in that case he was a veteran of the IDF. He lost his eyesight in the army, and he says it's a double pain, double hurt, not recognizing his sacrifice for the country, and embarrassing him publicly. So he says he found an interesting twist. Now this is where we start seeing twists in halakha. The first twist was Rabbi Yosef ben Haviva. Oh, the blind man cannot read the Torah because that is if he reads it himself. But if someone else reads and hears, it's okay. The Levush, Rabbi Mordechai says, in the name of the Zohar, when the Torah was given, Moshe was the intermediary, and the people kept quiet. So when you read the Torah in the Bet Knesset, the reader, or the layaner, as they read, the reader is like Moshe Rabbeinu, and the one who gets the Aliyah is like the Israelites. So he should keep quiet. He doesn't have to repeat it. So just hearing is okay. So he goes a step further. He says he doesn't even have to say it after the cantor. He just has to say it. Just has to listen. Now we have a different twist on it, and this is sort of a rule of thumb. When you see too many excuses or too many explanations, you know that either something is fundamentally wrong, or all these excuses are not telling you the truth. Meaning, the truth here is, that's what I think is, the rabbis throughout the generations decided we have to find a way to give a blind person aliyah. But we have a text that says no, so now we have to find a way to reconcile them. So there were two solutions that we saw so far. Now, in a book called Binyamin Ze'ev, which was written by Rabbi Binyamin ben Mattatya in Greece in the 16th century, he says, the blind man who can only read by heart cannot read the Sefer Torah. But this, יש לומר, היינו דווקא על המוציא אחרים ידי חובתן, כגון החזן והמקרה, הבקיא בקריאת התורה. This only refers to the cantor himself. If the cantor is blind, he cannot read the Torah for others because he has to cover for them.
Well, that's reading by heart.
That's reading by heart, right. So this is really a twist, but it says this is the meaning, the original meaning of the Mishnah that says that a blind person cannot read the Torah, meaning reading for others.
And just
so
to make
besides,
sure I understand,
yeah,
they're not allowed to read by heart because fearful they may make a mistake without being able to see.
We don't know why. This is sort of like a mystical rule. Dvarim shebichtav, yatar shanu me'al peh. Even though in later generations they said that they limited this rule. They said this is only when you didn't have enough written books. Now that you have enough written books, you could read by heart. So maybe what you're saying is true. That they were afraid that if you recite only by heart, you become the authentic source for the text. And maybe, those things happen, by the way.
Yeah.
So now the Binyamin Ze'ev, or Rabbi Binyamin ben Mattatya, says the restriction for a blind man to read is only if he is the Hazan. So we already find the third one. Then we have a teshuvah by Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who passed away recently. Well, he lived in the 20th century, and he writes to someone who argues against giving a blind person an aliyah. And he writes to him, "Ani roeh lekavod torato." This is on page 2. Hagam shemevi b'dvarav divrei. He quotes several books, Rabbi Haim David Azulai, Rov Dagan, other rabbis. Even though you yourself cited many rabbis who rule against Rabbi Yosef Karo, who say that you are allowed to give a blind man an aliyah, still you really strive to prove that it's forbidden. That is Rabbi Waldenberg speaking. So he says, and this is in the name of the Sephardic tradition. So he says, let me tell you what the book Pahad Yitzhak writes. Pahad Yitzhak, Rabbi Yitzhak Lampronti, lived in Italy in the 17th, 18th century, and he wrote an encyclopedia of Halakha called Pahad Yitzhak, where he wrote halachot under entries. So he had an entry of Suma, of a blind person, all the halachot that are related to it. And he writes the following: Bishnat Taf Lamed Het, in the year 1678, החכם הסומה, רבי בנימין אשכנזי מפראגה, שבין 2 שנים היה סומה מפני הווריל, בכל קהילות אשכנז ובכל קהילות איטליה, קראו אותו לספר תורה. So now he tells us a specific case. There was a rabbi, here's the name, Rabbi Binyamin Ashkenazi. Not only that, he tells you that he lost his eyesight because of a certain disease called varil, which I don't know what it is, I have to find out. He lost it at the age of 2 years. So 2 years old when he lost it. Either that, or with the word yud sheben, meaning for 2 years he lost his eyesight. Maybe it was something. It's a temporal thing, or gradual, like macular degeneration or something like that. Yet, in all of the communities in Germany and in Italy, he was honored with an aliyah. Probably was traveling among the communities, and he would get an aliyah. So we have a specific case of a rabbi getting an aliyah, but already we see the argument that I mentioned at the beginning. Now we're not talking just about an anonymous, a general case of someone who cannot see, but rather of a rabbi that we know by name and time period and where he lived. So it becomes more personal. And I almost feel as if the rabbis who wrote that were thinking, what if it happens to me? What if it happens to me and I lose my eyesight and I would be prevented from reading the Torah or doing a certain mitzvah? I need to legislate. I'm not saying that it's conscious, could be subconscious, but that's part of the empathy. When you feel that, you feel that what happened to him can happen to you as well, you understand the problem at a deeper level and you're willing to find a solution. And he says also, he goes on, Rabbi Yitzhak Lampondi to say, וכן במודנה, קראו רבי אשר לוי לספר תורה סומה, אף על פי שלא היה תלמיד חכם. And in the city of Modena, they called a man, here you have the name Asher Levi, was called to the Torah even though he was not a Talmid Chacham. Why? What is the big deal about him not being a Talmid Chacham? They said that the cantor reads for those who cannot read for themselves. But if someone is Am Haaretz and never bothered to learn how to read, ideally you should not give him an Aliyah, because he should learn. Go learn and read for yourself. So if someone is both blind and not learned, one could say, don't give him an Aliyah. He doesn't have the credit for that. But they gave him anyway. So it's not because of his scholarship, no, but rather because just anyone deserves an Aliyah even though he's blind. And the same thing in the city of Ferrara, in Italy, that anyone, Am Haaretz, even an ignorance, gets an Aliyah, even though he's a blind person. So he says we have a proof that this minhag of giving Aliyah to a blind person spread also among the Sephardim. So therefore, that person who publicly humiliated that blind man and prevented him from getting an Aliyah has erred. And he says, "Vehu rachum yechaper." May Hashem atone for his sin.
Yeah,
so he takes it to
one of the commandments. It says that you have to like somebody and you shouldn't lead a blind person.
נכון, לפני העיוור לא תיתן מכשול. Right, it's part of that. So, but now the problem is, and I said in the beginning, that it's done in the name of halakha. People say, of course, I love everyone, I care for everyone, but the halakha says that a blind person cannot read the Torah. So if he reads and he goes up and he says the bracha is in vain. Now, off the cuff, you have to know that reading the Torah publicly is a rabbinical practice. Saying a blessing is a rabbinical practice. The concern about saying Hashem's name in vain is also rabbinical. Because when you say, it's not biblical, no, because when the Torah says, it is, but when the Torah says, Lo tisa et Shem Adonai Elohecha lashav, it means do not make a false oath. That's called Laset et Shem Elohecha lashav, because you attach it to a testimony in court. You are validating a false a testimony with the name of God. But to say, if one wants to say all day long, praise be God and for what He did for me, and says Baruch Atah Eloheinu melech haolam shehayanu, because He's happy, you could do it all day long. So it's not in vain. If there is a meaning there, if there is intention, if what is Birkat Torah? What is Birkat Torah? We say it every morning. Baruch Atah, right? And I could say it when we give a class, where I say Baruch Atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim. Thank you for choosing us and giving us the Torah. Why wouldn't a blind person be able to do that? He also is part of that. Okay, so but on the other hand, embarrassing someone publicly or causing him pain is a biblical prohibition. So when you have a clash between a biblical prohibition and a rabbinical prohibition, which one wins? The biblical prohibition, don't break it. So those rabbis who worked hard to find a solution for the blind people, on one hand empathize with them, on the other hand understood intuitively that this limitation as written in the original Mishnah cannot really be applied on a regular basis.
So how are these Hachamim? coming up with this shtuah.
Different class.
Wait. Okay. Now we're dealing with. We have to remember that the rabbis who wrote the Mishnah basically created the system of brachot, of tefillot. Yes, and yes, maybe in certain cases the implications of certain restrictions were not thought thoroughly, because maybe it was not that common. Maybe they couldn't imagine how Torah reading will become such a central element. It is possible. And on the other thing is, and that is more important, I think, when you think about a deaf-mute person, they did not fully understand, because they didn't have the tools to understand the mental capacities of a deaf-mute person.
And I agree with that 100%. But they do have sensitivity as a human being.
They do have sensitivity.
That they do have.
Yes.
And you can't.
So that's why I say it was not intentional to cause pain to anyone. I'll give you an example just when we say about that. People, people with cerebral palsy, up to not too recently, people thought that they cannot communicate at all. Then they realized that they could communicate through certain signs, but it's a very slow process. It takes them a long time to point at signs and put them together. I think in the 60s or 70s, there was a Jewish gentleman who lived in Australia who wanted to invent an international language, ala Esperanto, but it wasn't necessary. He wanted to do it very concise, only with symbols. No one was able to command that language, and with a certain quirk of, I don't know how this happened, a certain school for kids with cerebral palsy in Canada got in touch with him, and those kids were able to take those symbols that he created and turn them into a language, and they could communicate with fluently paragraphs and sentences and paragraphs. So you have a case that of a certain condition that people could not understand up until recently. So to think that this was the same in rabbinical time is not so far-fetched.
We also look at it we're living in the 21st century. The mentality back then for people with disabilities was a lot different, so they would not even be classified.
It was different, but within Judaism, we must say, even though there were restrictions for people who were mentally ill, that they could not fully participate in Jewish life, but they were protected. So, for example, meaning that when you think about the mentally ill in France who were chained, basically, I think until the revolution, right? I don't know how long in Judaism they said that if you harm someone who's mentally ill, you will be fully punished. But if he harmed you, he is not held responsible. Or, for example, if a woman became mentally unstable, the husband is not allowed to divorce her, because then the fear is that she's going to be abused or taken advantage of. So he must keep her, even if in certain cases he will be allowed to remarry, but he must remain a custodian. So there is great sensitivity there. So, but this is part of the process. We're not claiming that at a certain point rabbis were not sensitive, but the original halakha was established and maybe not fully thought through what will be the impact for future generations. And throughout the years, different rabbis came up with different solutions of making the Torah accessible for the blind. Now, here is Rabbi Ovadia Yosef here's Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, writes in Yebi Omer this. כתב הגאון מהר"ם בן חביב. He quotes Rabbi Moshe ben Haviv from Salonika, 17th century, who says this: אף על פי שההלכה רווחת שאסור לקרוא בתורה אפילו תיבה אחת בעל פה שלא מטוב הכתב, even though we know that you cannot read from the Torah even one word by heart, And therefore a blind person cannot read the Torah. Even though this is known, מכל מקום עינינו הרואות כי מעשים בכל יום שהזקנים שאינם יכולים לקרוא בתורה אפילו תיבה אחת מתוך הספר אלא על ידי בתי עיניים. He says, wait a second, we see the reality. Now here, it's not a halachic argument anymore. The other rabbis that we saw made halachic arguments. The Talmud says a blind person cannot read the Torah, and they said, it means he cannot read by heart, cannot read for himself, cannot read for the community. He should not read. The ideal is for him to be quiet, and it's okay. Rabbi Moshe ben Haviv says, we see blind people getting Aliyah on a regular basis.
Right.
But who are those blind people? Yeah. He says, Aliyah bati aynayim, they wear glasses. He says, take off their glasses, they cannot read. So, in the time of the Mishnah, what would they be called? They would be blind. Right? So here's an interesting twist. It says, why would you consider that person a seeing person? Because he has glasses. That's a new invention. That according to the original halakha, he's not eligible to read the Torah. It says, and they say the bracha before and after, ve'en potzeh peh u'mtzaftzef. No one ever questioned that. ועל כיוצא בזה אמרו בירושלמי, כל הלכה שהיא רופפת בידיך, צא וראה איך הציבור נוהג ונהוג כן. He says, he quotes the Talmud Yerushalmi, whenever you don't know what the rule is, the halakha is in question, go and see what the people do and follow them. And then he quoted another rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov Reiser, from who lived in Prague in the 17th, 18th century. He says, אף על פי שיש מקום לומר, זקן שאינו רואה ראייה נכונה אלא על ידי בתי העיניים, לא הווה כרואה ממש. You could have argued that this kind of sight is not called eyesight, because if you take off the glasses, then he cannot see. מכל מקום, פוק חזה מאי עמד דבר, שהחזנים קוראים בספר תורה על ידי בתי העיניים. But if you look at the practice, exactly like Maram ben Haviv, the Hazanim read through glasses. So not only, now step further, not only the Oleh reads through glasses, the cantor himself. Think about that. In most synagogues, who would keep on reading the Torah? The one who read it for 30 and 40 years, he already knows it by heart. And at a certain point, he's going to use glasses. Now, this is really, I found that, I said, it's proved my point. That a rabbi empathizes with the problem that he sees as a personal thing. It says, regarding the levirate law, when God forbid one of the a brother passes away without children, and his sister-in-law should marry, the widow should marry her brother-in-law. So either they do yibum, he marries her, or they do halitza, remove the shoe. The Torah says clearly, she would come in front of the elders, and it says le'anei, they should see the whole process. ועינינו הרואות כי רוב בעלי הוראה הם החכמים וזקנים ממש יושבים אצל החליצה ורואים על ידי בתי העיניים. Says, but the rabbis, who are the rabbis who deal with such complicated cases? They are the elders, they are the veteran rabbis, and most of them wear glasses. So he says you have people who are legally blind sitting in judgment where they have to see the litigants or the two participants and they don't see them. So it means it's okay. What he said, what both of them say in other words is, really, the subconscious, this could happen to us as well. We are also the rabbis. What, are you going to write me off? It cannot be. So let me find a solution. Now let's move from this to the question of the deaf and the deaf mute, or the deaf blind. Because the argument of that rabbi was, you have to say the blessing must be heard by 10 people. Where do you get it? Where did you get it from? Where did you get it from? Is it really that idea that the people in the synagogue must hear the blessing? Or maybe the blessing must be communicated to them. And as long as they know that the blessing was said, they can say amen. Right? Who said that they have to hear words? And why was it, what was the real reason that a deaf mute person was originally blocked from getting an Aliyah?
So
So I'm reading that.
Potentially, can I ask?
What? Yeah.
So it means if you say a beracha internally,
Yeah, it is a beracha. It is a blessing. And the truth is that the blessing for the Torah, and that's the other argument, really you need to know the whole scope. The blessing for the Torah is not, the Aliyah is not dependent of the beracha. If someone went up to the Torah and did not say a beracha, and you had 7 people, you read for 7 people, you fulfilled the mitzvah. Actually, the original practice mentioned in the Mishnah was that the first one of the 7 olim says the first blessing,
the last one says,
and the last one says the last blessings. There are only 2 blessings for 7 people, and not 14 as we have today. Which I think, where we see that it would make more sense is when we don't have a Levi, and we say Amot Kohen Bimkom Levi. And it's a little strange that the Kohen just says, Baruch Ata Hashem, Asher Natan Bachar Banu. You read 3 psukim, Asher Natan Lanu. En Kohen, en Levi, Baruch Asher Bachar Banu. Baruch Hashem, Asher Natan Lanu. It looks repetitive. Okay, so really, you don't even need the beracha. But what you need is that the person who gets the Aliyah would know what is being read. Now, so there are 2 problems here. The one problem is that intuitively, you feel that the blind person hears the message of the Torah, even though he doesn't see it, but the deaf mute person does not hear it. But for the deaf mute, now that we understand that they're not mentally ill or mentally incapable as the rabbis in the time of the Mishnah thought, at least they could see, they could follow with the Hazan. But a deaf blind person has none of that. So in Yabia Omer, he says, whenever the rabbis included the deaf with minors and the mentally ill, they meant the deaf mute. But if one hears when people speak loudly or with a device, he is considered pikeh. He is like pikeh is from the word lifkoh, to open. So his ears are open, he can hear. An elderly scholar who uses a hearing aid is allowed to be a judge. This teaches us that hearing through a device is considered hearing. So, first of all, they made the concession also with deafness, that if you could hear through a device, it's called hearing. But note again, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef says, Talmid Hacham could be a Dayan. Again is the question of where is the personal connection, where is my narrative there? But he does admit, and that we know, the reason that the rabbis wrote off the deaf mute is because they were not able to communicate with them, so they thought that they are incapable, which is painful to hear today. But we don't know that if we lived back then, we would know that we would think differently.
Right.
So,
prior to being able to find ways to really teach much other than what you need to do to get through a day. Right? So there was no in-depth method of being able to teach or educate a blind and deaf person.
Right. I think also, back in the day, the society, except for Jewish society, was not so much text dependent. The text was needed for Torah learning, but other than that, most of your skills you acquired by observation and practice and being an apprentice. So a deaf-mute person could have done that, but they looked at it as is like a machine. He's just copying what you're doing. He doesn't have a deep understanding of what he does. But slowly they changed that. So now. One more source, Rabbi Avraham Danziger in Chayei Adam says you cannot say Kaddish, Kedusha, or Baruch Hu unless you have 10 people, because they have to understand what is being said. Because for them, a deaf-mute person does not understand.
No. But why do you have to have 10 people to say?
Okay, that's another. Yeah, but let's say the rabbis in the Mishnah established you need 10 people, and we established that those 10 people need to understand what's going on. So a minor, even though he understands, is not barda. But for a minor, it's another story. You had to draw the line, because if you don't draw the line between 13 and under 13. You would have to run a psychometric, a test for each person who comes into the synagogue. So those are things that are clearly visible. But Yalkut Yosef, I only want to look at the last line. He says, "Afilu im hu lomed bebeit sefer miyuchad lechershim ilmim ameknim da'at letalmidehem en letzarfo." Even if he studies in a special school for the deaf mute, which help the students acquire da'at, acquire knowledge. So the way he sees it is they don't have intrinsic knowledge or intelligence. It is something that they acquire from the outside, meaning in essence they still remain, as the rabbis understood, that someone who doesn't understand what's going on, but they are given like sort of an external help to get that. So here's my dilemma. Now we come to the question. I want to argue that just like a hearing or seeing person can get an aliyah, and just as the rabbis found ways to allow a blind person to get an aliyah, and they found ways to allow a person who lost part of his hearing and hears through a device or a hearing aid to get an aliyah, so also we should do it for the deaf mute and the deaf blind. How would I argue that? So I would go directly back to the Torah. The Torah says the following: "V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot." The whole nation in Matan Torah, it says they saw the sounds. This is what people call it's synesthesia. It's two senses coming together. Did they see or did they hear? So neither. It's to see the voices means that you just know what's going on. You can't even define if you saw the words or you heard the words, but you understood the words. That's really the meaning of ro'im et hakolot. That it becomes so embedded in you that you feel. Now, a deaf person who's communicating with ASL sees the voices.
They will see.
Right? And a deaf blind person who gets it through touch feels the voices. And not only that, the people come to Moshe and says, you talk to us because we cannot hear directly from God. So now Moshe is the interpreter. So it is valid to hear Torah through an interpreter. And God goes on to say, tell the people, you saw that I spoke with you. There's a repetition of the same idea of seeing the voices. So if we think of, again, the reason, why do we say the blessing for the Torah? For the benefit that we derive from the Torah. And that is something at the moral, personal, human level, everyone enjoys, right? But here's another interesting pasuk, especially interesting with the midrash on it. Towards the end of the Torah in Devarim, the pasuk says, "Ve'ata kitvu lachem et hashira azot ve'lameda et bnei Israel." Write this poetry, which the rabbis understand as referring to the whole Torah. The Torah is shira. Ve'lameda et bnei Israel. Teach it to the Israelites. Sima befiem. Put it in their mouth. Put it in their mouth. How do you put something in someone's mouth? By talking, it goes to the ear, right? So the Midrash says this: Amar Rav Hizda, en Torah niknet ela besimanim. The Torah could only be acquired through signals. Al tikrei sima ela simana, because the word sima also means siman. So he means signals, signs, musical notes, mnemonic devices. But in other words, it's the acquiring the Torah it could be maybe stenography. You don't have to remember the whole Torah word by word, but remember bullets, remember the rules. So if a deaf mute person or a deaf blind person can understand the core ideas and the words and the messages, even if it takes longer for him to hear regular Aliyah, based on all that we've seen so far, we could argue that with our newly acquired understanding of the ability of the deaf mute and the deaf blind to communicate, the halakha should be that they should get regular aliyot. And if we want everyone to answer amen, people should assume when the person went there and did something with signs that he said the bracha and you just say amen, or the interpreter should interpret it to the community and say, now say amen. And we actually have a historical case of the great synagogue in Alexandria that was so big that the people could not hear the Hazan. So the Gabbai would stand next to him and raise a flag, like for amen. So they could say the bracha even though they didn't hear it. So based on all that, I would argue that that is just from the halachic point of view, but really my argument is that we should empathize and understand the problem, not to reject people because we don't feel that their problem applies to us.